In this video, I'll talk about Planetside 2, one of my favorite multiplayer games of all time. I'll be going through what makes this game special, why it's so full of potential, why it deserved better, and why I think it's still worth playing. If I were to describe this game in 3 words, it would be Battlefield on steroids. It features the infantry gunplay and vehicle combat that is expected of Battlefield games, with an insanely high player limit of, I believe, a few thousand per map. This game was released in 2013. However, a more accurate partner would be Foxhole. Both games are featuring combined arms warfare between large groups of players and heavily incentivized cooperation with and within organized player groups. Planetside 2 though has 3-way team fights that Foxhole lacks. So with a premise like that, why is Planetside 2 not more popular than it currently is? In this video, I'll draw on my experiences to provide some kind of explanation. Do note that I spent most of my time as an infantry player, with limited ground vehicle knowledge and no time spent in air vehicles. Additionally, I picked up the game somewhere around 2015, quit a year later, and returned in mid-2025, so in comparison to many others, I have a rather narrow frame of reference. If anyone who is more familiar with the game wishes to add anything, feel free to do so in the comments. The setting of the game is nothing complicated. The game technically has 4 factions, but functionally 3. They are the militaristic authoritarian Terran Republic, the corporate new conglomerate, and the cult-like alien worshipping Vanu sovereignty. Story-wise, the NC split off from and declared war on the TR because they were treated like shit, and the Vanu split off and declared war on the other 2 because the game needs a 3rd faction. Now they're fighting over the planet of Oraxis, which is where the game takes place. Each faction has quirks and traits that help them stand out, on top of unique options for weapons and vehicles. Note that each faction has a unique main battle tank and fighter aircraft. The Terran Republic's kinetic weapons generally feature a high rate of fire, a high magazine capacity, but suffers from a slightly weaker damage model. This makes their weapons more forgiving in close quarters because the rate of fire can compensate for lower accuracy or player skill. This is the faction that I played when I returned to the game a few months ago, and the one I'm most familiar with right now. The new conglomerate's Gauss weapons generally feature a stronger damage model but with a lower rate of fire. The NC is known as the shotgun faction because of the prevalence of shotguns in many of their loadouts. NC players also have to be more careful with friendly fire because it is affected by weapon damage. This is the faction that I started with when I first picked up the game. The Vanu Sovereignty's plasma weapons generally feature higher accuracy and their projectiles experience less or no bullet drop, unlike that of the other 2 factions. Also, the VS seems to be more infantry focused since their weapon characteristics favor such engagements, and I've heard that their exclusive vehicles are weaker on average. This is the faction that I'm least familiar with as I'm just getting started with it. The 4th faction is Nanite Systems, which deploys players to aid the faction with the lowest population on the continents, unless the player in question is a member for some reason. They also provide all 3 factions with plenty of weapons, which is why every player can unlock and use NS weapons on top of their faction-specific options. I can't say anything more because I've not touched this faction at all as of the making of this video. If I were to recommend a faction for players who are new to this genre, I'd recommend the Vanu Sovereignty, simply because the generally higher accuracy and lower recoil makes infantry weapons easier to learn, and the lack of bullet drops makes aiming and sniping easier. For any other new player, I'd recommend picking whichever faction catches your eye the most. It is also worth noting that each faction has a different genre of music that makes the game feel completely different depending on which faction you're currently playing as, so that's an incentive as well. Planetside 2's infantry combat can be very enjoyable as the selection of weapons and classes provide plenty of options and opportunities for both team players and lone wolves. In terms of weapons, all classes have close range and mid-range options and at least one anti-vehicle option. Aside from the infiltrator, the balancing of these classes is generally well done. The gunplay is tight and satisfying, although do note that the headshot multiplier is high and friendly fire is a thing. Additionally, the developers made most of the default infantry weapons quite powerful so that new players wouldn't be at a disadvantage. The TR's T1 Cycler and NC's AF-19 Mercenary stand out as particularly good options, and I often see experienced players using them. For new players, I'd recommend supporting teamfights as Medic and Engineer because they provide more ways to contribute as well as plenty of certs and EXP, which can be of great help while they learn the game. To my knowledge, there are not many weapons that are straight up overpowered, although there are a few that are annoying to go up against. As for vehicles, players can pick from a variety of shared vehicles, as well as their faction-specific main battle tanks and fighter aircraft. The Flash, or as I like to call it the Mongoose, is best used to harass infantry as it can fit a gun and cloaking device. The Harasser does good damage and can be very annoying in vehicle engagements. The Sunderer is a mobile weapons platform and mobile spawn point. The Lightning is a light tank that can work well against infantry and vehicles, and the main battle tank is best used against enemy ground vehicles and structures. Even now, each still has their own role to play, and all are worth trying out. It is worth noting that ground vehicle balance used to be tighter, but I'll cover that one later. Much like Battlefield games, I would say that infantry combat is the strongest and most well-balanced part of Planetside 2's interactions, on top of being the most accessible. As for game flow, each battle takes place on a continent, with many bases located within. To capture a base, attackers must capture control points and wait out a timer. The more points the attackers have, the faster the timer will be. To facilitate this, attackers usually spawn from Sunderers, giving it the ability to start big team fights as more players are funneled towards the conflict. Sunderers are thus a prime target for defenders. Each base is linked to at least two others, which dictate whether a base can be captured. Simply put, each base is comparable to a mini conquest map and act as a control point on a much larger battlefield. Every now and then, an alert will pop up, declaring that whichever faction takes the most territory within an hour and a half controls the continent. This plays into the game's flow as well, as taking over and locking down a continent allows another to become available, providing a fresher experience for players every now and then. So far, Planetside 2 sounds like a great game, and it can be at times, but that depends on the many factors that may or may not be present. The greatest design flaws in this game, I would say, are questionable balance decisions and a general lack of control in player resources. As Planetside 2 has a ton of usable items and vehicles, it is impossible to balance all of them, which is understandable from a developer perspective. However, as the years go on, as more balance patches are released, and as the keys are handed over from studio to studio, a few problems have remained and a few more have been created. I'll begin with the Infiltrator class. This class features sniper rifles and cloak, but they can also equip SMGs and battle rifles. Since cloaked players are pretty much completely invisible at mid to long range, those who play aggressively are more fun to play against, because there are risks and interactions between both the infiltrators and their opponents. However, sniper users can dictate the rules of engagement, especially so in this game. This reduces interaction on both sides to please hit or please don't one-shot me. All throughout Planetside 2's long lifespan, the design of this class has remained a very controversial topic. Given how sniper rifles in general are extremely difficult to balance in PvP games, given the sniper class the ability to cloak was very questionable, to put it mildly. As for ground vehicles, balance seems to be all over the place right now. Vehicles are difficult to balance in games that feature combined arms warfare, and credit should be given here as Planetside 2's vehicles are individually generally less oppressive compared to the tanks in Battlefield. A common target of complaints is the Vanu Sovereignty's Mag Rider, thanks to its ability to easily dodge projectiles and climb mountains, although it has a lower health pool compared to the TR and NC counterparts. A greater, more recent issue is that Sunderers are quite overpowered when it comes to fighting other vehicles. About a year before my return to this game, the developers wanted to make Sunderers more survivable when deployed, but they ended up over-buffing them, making them way too fast and durable without giving lightnings and main battle tanks equivalent buffs or nerfing the Sunderers' own guns. As a result, vehicle balance is in a terrible state now, because Sunderers are fast enough to catch up to Harassers, strong enough to destroy main battle tanks in a duel, and outlast everything else thanks to its new self-healing ability. Since there is less incentive to use main battle tanks and almost no incentive to use the lightning, Sunderer spam is quite common nowadays throughout all three factions, which is a goddamn shame. Another fundamental issue with this game is absolute player freedom, as in the lack of controls when it comes to player numbers and spawning vehicles. For player counts, there is nothing preventing players from switching to another faction with another character or heavily outnumbering the opposing faction to take over a base. This can kill team fights before they even happen and end ones that may have been more enjoyable with a more balanced population. As for vehicle spawning, the developers attempted to balance it by giving each player a regenerating resource that is spent when respawning, with grenades, utility items, or when spawning vehicles. This is a good system as it prevents individual players from endlessly spawning new vehicles when their previous one gets destroyed. However, it does not consider large groups of players doing the same thing, which was a huge mistake for a game that relies on player groups to start and maintain large teamfights. This often results in large armored columns capturing numerous bases uncontested, and taking advantage of their strength in numbers and firepower to hopefully ward off an eventual counterattack. The lack of control over the player's options is a symptom of the game's format and causes a slew of problems that are much more difficult to fix than, say, weapon and vehicle balancing. Essentially, players are trusted to self-govern when it comes to player and vehicle count, which is not as reliable as a player or vehicle limit per base, for example. Planetside 2 is an old game. Even having thousands of players participating in a persistent battle taking place in a huge open map is still an achievement, as very few games even attempt this feat today. As the population naturally declines over the years, there have been mergers and other background stuff that made the servers less stable. Although I live nowhere nearby, I play on the US West server, because it was either that or Europe. Even when there are not many players, I've experienced moments where the server shits itself for half a minute, in which everyone keeps teleporting everywhere and some of my inputs aren't even registered. Aside from server complications, Planetside 2 still has a few blatant cheaters, as with every online multiplayer game. However, this game's anti-cheat is old and probably obsolete, so nothing can be done, I guess. Even though Planetside 2 can be very enjoyable and offers a ton of freedom for players, these issues, and probably others that I'm not aware of, have resulted in the population declining even faster for many years, resulting in some players calling the game dead and others routinely being surprised that the servers haven't shut down yet. Planetside 2 is a game that heavily incentivizes players to communicate and cooperate with one another, and so large clans have always played a major role in terms of enabling large fights. But as the game ages, the balance and direction of the game become less clear, and it becomes a lot more likely for dedicated players to move on to other games, and many already have. Even now, Planetside 2 struggles to hold enough players to support large teamfights, and the number of players fluctuates massively depending on the time of day. The low overall population is to be expected of such an old game, and the bleeding of active players has sadly been hastened thanks to mismanagement and weird decision making at times. At this point, I'm not sure how long it will be before remaining players struggle to even find more than 10 players in a base, let alone the large team fights that the game is supposed to have. Ultimately, Planetside 2 suffers much more from a low player count than other FPS games because of how the game is, and although I'm disappointed to return to a game that is only alive at certain times of day, I should probably be glad that the opportunity to return is even here. In conclusion, Planetside 2 is a gem of a game that is very bold, fun, and unique, but it suffers from a long history of balance issues and an extremely volatile balance of power that entirely depends on how many players there are and how evenly they're split between the three factions. If only the game was managed better, things could have been different. It's a shame, really. If you're still interested in the game upon hearing all this, I'd still recommend it, as it is a game that provides an experience unlike any other. It may not have the graphical fidelity and tighter balance of Battlefield or the in-depth vehicle combat of War Thunder, but it doesn't need them to be enjoyable. Planetside 2 is still alive today because of how unique it is, and although I regret dropping the game and not touching it for over 8 years, I'm glad I picked it up in 2015, when the population was much higher than that of today. As of now though, I'd suggest logging in only during peak hours and taking part in those team fights. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching.